Hi, thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk about a book that I just completed. The book is called Language and Thought and Action. The book is written by S.I. Hayakawa. Now, this book is in the category of semantics. Semantics is the study of meaning. The first edition of this book was published in 1939, and then there were many editions afterwards, so that tells me that it was popular and was reprinted. The reason why I read this book is mainly because of the author. I'm interested in the author of the book. His name is S.I. Hayakawa. So sometimes the way that I read things, I have a very exploratory nature, and I'm curious. The name S.I. Hayakawa relates to when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1970s and 80s. And the name S.I. Hayakawa was often in the news. S.I. Hayakawa was in the news because there were many social events and social protests. S.I. Hayakawa was born in Canada, but his parents were Japanese. His mother was Japanese and his father was Japanese. Then he moved to the United States and he got into semantics, became a professor. Higher education in San Francisco is called San Francisco College. Now I think it's called San Francisco State University. One of the things that happened there was they started the first Black Studies program in higher education. So he was part of that. He was an administrator. Then he ran for the Senate for the state of California. And it was a close race, but he won. He became a U.S. Senator from the state of California to Washington, D.C. Now, this was really a monumental thing because he was the first California senator where both his parents were born in another country. Now, the next California senator whose parents were born in another country after Hayakawa was Kamala Harris. And she's our current vice president. There were many years between S.I. Hayakawa and Kamala Harris. So I'm trying to emphasize what an amazing person he was to be foreign born, to take all the criticisms that can involve, and to rise to the level that he did. So I was just interested in filling a space in my mind and identifying who S.I. Hayakawa was, so that's why I read the book. The book is kind of interesting. It's kind of like a textbook because there's 18 chapters, and after each chapter there's kind of a discussion area, which he calls applications, where he brings up things. But this is an extremely well-written book. So as far as language and action, he convinced me that he knows how to write, and he has he makes a lot of great points, and he makes them efficiently with examples. So I'm going to go over some of the things I enjoyed best about this book. He starts off in an obvious way, and he talks about how important language is. And, obviously we know that. If you're a booktuber, you read a lot. So, it's kind of obvious, but it's good to restate how important language is in our lives. Pretty much everybody depends on it in every culture. This kind of obvious introduction is important to set the area out that he's going to cover. And he talks about how language has to do with symbols. The words are for symbols. He talks about the language, though we use it and it's extremely useful, it's not completely accurate to reality. So language is the map, it's not the territory. When someone's describing something, or when someone's talking or describing, even in scientific language, it's an estimation of what's going on. It's a map of what they are communicating, because though words are so powerful, they can also be inaccurate, they can be vague, they're not exactly empirically correct, So you should remember that in the verbal world, language is a report of what's going on. There's another thing that is actually the experience of what's going on. So language is the map, and the extensional world, he calls it, is the territory. There's the map, and this is territory. So even though you read about something, you should always prepare that what you read about can be inaccurate when you actually interact with what they're talking about. So that's a very general thing. I know language is used in many areas. It's used in science, it's used in journalism, it's used in imagination, it's used in poetry. There's so many different uses. It's practical matters, recipes. This is a very general overview of language. Then he talks about dictionaries, and this was something kind of new to me. I didn't really realize this. He kind of straightened something out in my head, and that is about dictionaries, and that dictionaries are telling you that the way the word is being used, that's what a dictionary entry is. The dictionary entry for a word is not the authoritative way to use the word. It's just the way that historically that word has been used. So we all know words can change meaning, and different contexts can change the meaning of a word. So I'm going to move to chapter 7, language of social control, and how language makes things happen, language in action. He starts to move into that area. One of the things that I think about when I'm reading, I always try to question some things, but I do realize that I have weak spots, and certain types of language can really influence me and make me believe what they're saying. And I am affected by enthusiasm and charm, and those kind of things can really convince me of what's going on. Where sometimes I might read a real cold scientific paper, and because there's no charm in it, I'm kind of like, who cares? Though it might be saying something really monumental. It took me years to learn that about myself, of how I react to the language that I'm hearing and the language that I'm reading. Then I like this one section on verbal hypnotism. Some people never listen to what is being said, since they are interested only in what might be called the gentle inward message that the sound of the words gives them. Just as cats and dogs like to be stroked, so do some human beings like to be verbally stroked at fairly regular intervals. It is a form of rudimentary sensual gratification. Because listeners of this kind are numerous, intellectual shortcomings are rarely a barrier for a successful career in public life, on the stage or the networks, on the lecture platform, or in the ministry. Okay, now because a lot of people here might be from BookTube, I want to talk about literature, what literature is for. Literature is the exact expression of feelings, while science is the most exact kind of reporting. You really got to make a distinction between literature and science, because they are in conflict. Because if science is true, then literature or religion is nonsense. If literature or religion is true, science is merely pretentious ignorance. What should be understood when people tell us that certain statements are scientifically true is that they are useful and verifiable formulations suitable for the purposes of organized cooperative workmanship. What should be understood when people tell us the plays of Shakespeare or poems of Milton or Dante are eternally true is that they produce in us attitudes towards our fellow men, an understanding of ourselves, or feelings of deep moral obligation that are valuable to humanity under any conceivable circumstances. Poetry, which condenses all the effective resources of language into patterns of infinite rhythmical subtlety, may be said to be the language of expression at its highest degree of efficiency. In a very real sense, people who have read good literature have lived more than people who cannot or will not read. To have read Gulliver's Travels is to have had the experience with Jonathan Swift of turning sick at one's stomach at the conduct of the human race. To have read Native Son is to know how it feels to be frustrated in the particular way in which many Negroes in Chicago are frustrated. This is the great task that effective communication performs. It enables us to feel how others felt about life, even if they lived thousands of miles away and centuries ago. It's not true that we have only one life to live. If we can read, we can live as many more lives and many kinds of lives as we wish. He talks about two-valued orientation. This is how people think in black and white, and how that is really prevalent in society, and it kind of gives people a sense of security because there's an authority to what they're saying, but they always demonize the other side, and we should try to moderate that extremes, because that can cause us to believe false things. One of the problems with that is that he says the two-valued orientation increases combativeness, but sharply diminishes the ability to evaluate the world accurately. When guided by it for any purposes other than fighting, we practically always achieve the results opposite from what those intended. Oh, and I really like this chapter on 15 on poetry and advertising. He makes the point that modern poetry is so kind of obscure. The real poetry these days is in advertising. The unsponsored poet of today works in a semantic environment in which almost all the poetry that ordinary people hear and read is sponsored poetry of consumer goods. Poetic language is used so constantly and relentlessly for the purposes of salesmanship that it has become almost impossible to say anything with enthusiasm or joy or conviction without running into the danger of sounding as if you're selling something. Then he has a good example here. Here's Robert Herrick, who wrote, "Whereas in silks my Julia goes, then, methinks how sweetly flows the liquefaction of her clothes." Or William Wordsworth wrote, "She was a phantom of delight when first she gleamed upon my sight, a lovely apparition sent to be a moment's ornament. Her eyes as stars of twilight fair." Today, such lines remind us inevitably of the promises of advertising copy. Herrick's Julia is a testimonial to the effects of wearing Von Raalte lingerie and Hanes hosiery, while Wordsworth's unnamed beauty obviously exemplifies the results of using Clairol or the new Max Factor eyeshadow. I really like this, and I've thought about this myself. It's about how everybody is part of an institution, and they affect our thinking and our language. Once people become accustomed to institutions, they eventually get to feeling that their particular institutions represent the only right or proper way of doing things. So this loyalty to one's own institutions is understandable. Almost everyone in any culture feels that his institutions are the very foundation of reasonable living. A challenge to those institutions is almost inevitably felt to be a threat to all orderly existence. But many institutions don't have problems changing. And when I was thinking about different institutions, like religion institutions are very slow to change, whereas technology as an institution is very quick to change. So it depends on the type of institution you're in. As you become more accustomed to your institutional thinking, you can lose your own personality because you acquiesce to the institutional thinking and stop thinking for yourself. But to have nothing but institutionalized attitudes is eventually to have no personality of one's own, and therefore to have nothing original or creative to contribute to the institutions of which one is a member. Furthermore, there's a danger to one's personal adjustment implicit in continually living by high-level generalizations and repressing or avoiding extensional evaluations. People who are not accustomed to distinguishing between attitudes institutionally arrived at and those extensionally arrived at are capable of real self-deception. In a real sense, they don't know which of their opinions are simply parrot-like repetitions of institutional opinions and which are the result of their own experience and their own thinking. Lacking that self-insight, they are unable to arrive at realistic self-concepts. They are unable to map accurately the territory of their own feelings and attitudes. Wow, that's so important. It's it can be difficult to do because we live in a world where things are happening so fast and we have to make decisions so fast. When we have to think or speak, we can grab on to institutional thinking because the institution tells us what to think rather than really evaluating it. You have to really slow down and think, is the thought that I'm thinking, is that my own thought or is that a thought from the institution? Maybe you agree with the institutional thinking. Maybe it's good, but maybe it's wrong. And so ideally you should have a blend of the institutional thinking and your own thinking. That would be the ideal. But it takes a lot of effort, a lot of mental effort to do that. And I understand, we don't have time for that because so many things that we have to do in a day. But that's a very valuable self-discipline. So that wraps it up. Language and Thought and Action by S.I. Hayakawa. Thanks for watching.